Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session of the June 2nd, 2020 Board of County Commissioners meeting. We've got several public work items up here first, and then after that, we'll probably go back to county administration announcements and then finish out the agenda. Our first item is 11A, the fifth reading ordinance 20-01 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 11 to update definitions, modernize terminology, amend the code in light of recent changes to state law, and update referenced codes and statutes. And with us, I believe we have Steve McGuire, building official, and Alyssa Baz, plans examiner, and John Webster, plans examiner. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair Buck. As a result of the third reading and hearing on April 21st, 2020, land management staff was directed by the board to include language in the Lane Code Chapter 11 section for special rules for temporary campgrounds, to include language for the prompt response of emergency responders to specify campsite locations. This proposed code change is shown in item 6. There were 6 total changes to the code that I will read through. In subsection 11.443 of Lane Code Chapter 11, item number 4, deletion for the description of outdoor assembly, and instead a reference to the subsection of existing Lane Code Chapter 3, subsection 3.995, item 3C, that defines assembly was referenced. Item number 2 that was updated in subsection 11.443, item number 5, a change in the requirement that the site be restored to conditions existing to the event within 72 hours was changed to 96 hours. Item number 3 in subsection 11.444, item 2, there's a deletion of the maximum size limitation on temporary camping space. Item number 4 in subsection 11.446, item 6, an alteration for the minimum size of waste recycling receptacles was changed from 50 gallons to 30 gallons in capacity. In item number 5, subsection 11.446, item 7C, there was a replacement from the language of the word instructed, and instead provided with information was included, such that campers must be provided with information as to the location of fire protection equipment and a shovel and how to use it. In item 6 of subsection 11.443, item 3, there was a correction of a minor typo in Lane Code that was in, and it was corrected now to is. That concludes the amendments that were instructed for staff to change by the board on the third reading, April 21st. Since the last reading, staff has had communications with several stakeholders to clarify some issues. There was some confusion between some of the rules for personal camping on private property and for the temporary campground rules that are in a different section, as well as some concerns that were in Chapter 3 about outdoor assembly and mass gathering language that is not part of the current code modifications. That concludes the staff report for this section. Thank you, Commissioners.
Any questions or comments? Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. We got a letter by email from Mr. Sherlock with Hutchinson Cox. Are those the issues you were just referring to that have been talked about with the stakeholders, or are you aware of that letter and the 5 items it addresses?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Bozovich. There were 3 main items that were discussed with the stakeholders that were summarized in the letter that came yesterday from Mr. Sherlock. And these are the items that I primarily was referencing, there's some confusion about the limitations for exemptions for personal camping that were outlined in that letter, and the permits necessary for temporary campgrounds. For instance, when reading the special rules for temporary campgrounds, there's no maximum size for campsites. However, if you want to have an exemption to have personal camping on your property, for instance, if you were to have your family come and camp out for a weekend, that would be limited to 1,000 square feet in the area. So there's a sections 11.120, item number 5 lists a lot of the requirements for exemptions for personal camping, whereas the subsections 11.443 through 11.446 address requirements for temporary campgrounds. And there were also some concerns relating to Chapter 3 with the outdoor assembly license that have been discussed multiple times with the staff and various stakeholders. But those items are not slated to change with this Chapter 11 update, which is primarily referencing building codes.
Excellent. I was concerned we were going to have to go into another couple readings to fix some of these questions. I'm glad they've been addressed. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on this item? Okay, I believe that staff has recommended that we move approval of the 5th reading and enact ordinance number 20-01 as presented. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Bozovich, second by Commissioner Burney. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll move to the vote. All those,
Commissioner?
Yeah, oh, yes?
I'm sorry, Andy Clark here. We'll need a roll call vote for this.
We'll need, that's right. Thank you for checking on me. Roll call vote. We'll have you do that, Mr. Mokarski.
The last time I did this, I was confused too because you're out of order, but I'll just go with Commissioner Bozovich.
Aye.
Commissioner Farr.
Am I out of order?
Well, can you
Aye.
move? Can you move a little bit over to the? Sorry.
Hey, you're getting personal now, Jay.
How did you vote, Commissioner Farr?
Aye, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Sorensen.
It looks on my screen like Commissioner Bozovich is incurring into my 6 feet of space here, but I do vote aye.
Commissioner Burney.
Aye.
It's good we're all smiling, folks. And Commissioner Buck.
Aye.
5-0. Thank you.
All right, passes unanimously. We'll move on to item 11B, which is the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-05 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 14 to make corrections required by the Land Use Board of Appeals, remand of ordinance 19-03, that is LUBA number 2019-128, adopting a savings and severability clause and declaring an emergency. And I see Commissioner Sorensen's hand up.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that at the outset that Ms. Eichner and the Public Works staff sent me an email, which I really appreciate, saying that I didn't have a conflict of interest on this matter and that no comments have been received by Mr. Malone. So therefore, I currently not aware of any conflict I have on this.
Okay, so we have Lindsay Eichner on to talk about this one. Take it away, Lindsay.
Hello, Chair, Commissioners. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, just checking. Good afternoon. We are trying to bring this minor change in language to you as quickly as possible. We received just one modification that Luba asked us to make. So that is in the packet before you today, and we're just requesting a approval of the first reading and setting of the second reading and public hearing for 2 weeks.
Any questions or comments for staff on this one? Okay, I don't see any, so I will look for a motion to approve the first reading and setting the second reading for June 16th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.
So moved.
Second.
I'm sorry, Andy Clark again. Can we also note that there's a hearing with that second reading for the motion?
Yes, stand corrected with the hearing. Okay, moved by Commissioner Burney, second by Commissioner Bozovich. Any discussion? Seeing none, this one we can do a regular vote. So I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Okay, we're on to item 11C. First reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-06 in the matter of amending lane code 16-090 definitions, LC 16.210 F1 zone, LC 16.211 F2 zone, LC 16.212 EFU zone, LC 16.214 ML zone, and LC 16.264 telecommunications tower standards, and make corrections required by the Land Use Board of Appeals remand of ordinance 18-08, LUBA number 2019-024, adopting a savings and severability clause and declaring an emergency file, file number 509-PA20-05262. And we have Lindsay Eichner again.
Hello again, Chair, Commissioners. This is kind of the same deal. First, requesting approval of the first reading, setting of the second reading, and public hearing for 2 weeks from now.
Any questions for staff? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Lindsay, could you explain the reason for the emergency declaration?
So the reason why we are requesting emergency declarations are because we are, for Chapter 14, is immediately dependent on these Chapter 16 amendments. And then we're trying to get these enacted, and then we're going to be coming to you in not too long with more amendments. And so we want to, our staff has been this back and forth with the LUBA remands of using one version of the code or the other version of code, and what application form are we using? Is it the right one? Depending on when an application was submitted, what do we make findings to? And so the sooner we can get the amended code adopted and enacted, I think it'll be a lot easier and smoother for staff and the public to be able to use the code instead of going back and forth to older versions and newer versions. Just a lot of confusion. There's appeals that happen, and we're trying to figure out what code is in place at what point. So we're trying to just make the minor fixes that LUBA has requested that we make in order to make sure that our code is defensible and consistent with state law, and then hopefully then we'll be able to use it to that effect. So that's
a great
the main reason.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. So it's really to make the entire process move faster. It's not necessarily this particular item that's an emergency. It's making everything move more slowly. And in this being an emergency, what does that allow you to do specifically? Does it give you 30 days, 60 days, or does it reduce it to a certain number of days?
So typically an ordinance is effective, or for at least the code amendments that I work on, I can let Andy speak if it's different for other ordinances, but for the zoning code amendments, they're typically effective 30 days after the board votes and approves the ordinance. The emergency clause allows the language to be effective that day that you vote and approve the language, if you so choose to do so. So it makes it effective immediately.
Perfectly clear. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for staff on this one? I don't see any. So I would entertain a motion to approve the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-06 for June 16th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Burney, second by Commissioner Bozovich. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Okay, we got one more here, item 11D. The first reading and first reading and setting the second reading for public hearing for ordinance 20-07 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16.251 non-conforming uses rural comprehensive plan to extend the time period before non-conforming uses are considered discontinued and to update chapter 14 references file number 509-PA20-05-239. And we have this time, I believe, Shauna Adams, Senior Planner.
Thank you, Chair Buck, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes, we
As
can.
you know, great. I'm hearing nods and a question.
Commissioner Sorensen, you want to speak before staff?
Yeah, I just need to ask, in looking over the agenda cover memo and some of the material, I didn't see any references to Sean Malone or Landwatch Lane County. And I don't know if I've sent you my standard email asking if I'd be notified about that so I could make a declaration of a possible conflict of interest. Do you know of any of materials from Mr. Malone or that group?
We have not received any.
Okay, thank you very much. In the future, could you confer with Ms. Eichner just so you can send me an email comparable to the one that she sent me on the other items that she was presenting on?
Certainly.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, Ms. Adams, feel free to proceed.
Great. As you know, on April 7th, 2020, the board directed Land Management Division staff and County Council to explore drafting of an ordinance to extend lane code time limitations that apply to lawful nonconforming uses whose status might be put at risk by the cancellation of events due to COVID-19. We've drafted ordinance number 2007 to address this board directive. Today, staff requests that the board approves the first reading and set a second reading and public hearing for June 16th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. time certain via webinar. Staff looks forward to returning to the June 16th hearing and plan to present an overview of the draft amendments at that time.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-07 for June 16th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.
I move approval.
Second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Sorensen, second by Commissioner Burney. Looks like there's some discussion. Commissioner Farr. It looks like you're on mute, Commissioner Farr.
Can't you read my lips? Just to know that there is no emergency clause in this ordinance. Anyone watching knows sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. There is always a reason for there to be an emergency clause if there is one.
I would clarify the title doesn't include an emergency clause, but the actual ordinance does include an emergency clause. And the reason being is the time sensitivity in the statements that were made in the original board assignment. It was assumed that that would be desired.
Okay, so I would have to read the material then. The public will have to read the material to know that there's an emergency clause with this motion.
Indeed.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Oh, Commissioner Pasovich?
I'll just say real quick, it is important to have an emergency clause attached to this because we're coming up on 1 year for the Oregon Country Fair. And if we pass this on the 16th and it's not effective till 30 days, it'll be beyond the fair's date. So it's really important that we have that extension of the timeline effective prior to the country fair date.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, I would entertain a motion to approve the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-07 for June 16th at 1:30 p.m.
I thought we already did that.
We did that, yeah.
Did I? I'm sorry.
Commissioners
We're doing discussion. I'm so sorry. We'll just call for a vote then. There's this like they're sorry.
I was very proud of seconding Commissioner Sorensen's motion.
All right, let's vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Aye.
All right, motion passes unanimously. Okay, we will go to item 11E, work session in the matter of stormwater program changes and funding. And we have with us Dan Hurley, our Director of Public Works. And if you want to introduce the rest of your folks, that would be great.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm joined here today by Maria Papagalis. She's our stormwater expert for Public Works, our 1 FTE of dedicated stormwater personnel. Also join Peg Kepler is on the line with us from Engineering Construction Services. She's our county engineer. And then we have a consultant with us today, John Gillarducci from the FCS Group, who's done some work on analyzing a stormwater utility for us in the past and will present on that work. So we're here today to talk about stormwater, to continue the conversation we started with you last fall. We were with you in November, and Maria talked at that time about the new stormwater permit we'd received, our NPDES permit, and the big concerns we have for the growing expenses for stormwater. We're looking at an increase of several $1 million annually and major concerns for the long-term solvency of the road fund with that impact. So Maria will talk about that issue and refresh you on that. And she's also going to talk about stormwater in general, realizing that stormwater, a lot of people just don't know what goes into stormwater. It's this hidden infrastructure underneath the ground, under our roads, that's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But it's part of our infrastructure nonetheless, and it's expensive to maintain. You know, like any other infrastructure, it has a finite life that needs to be repaired, reinvested in, and maintained in order to keep that system clean so that the water arrives clean to our waterways as the water comes off our roads and our landscapes. So Maureen will talk about that with some pictures to kind of talk about what stormwater is. I know that Commissioner Bozovich has quite a bit of background in that area, but for folks that haven't worked in stormwater, we wanted to talk about that a little bit to paint the picture. Maureen will talk about the permit, what's driving these new expenses, the new requirements, lower thresholds we're having to implement stormwater systems. And we know that this is a horrible time to talk about new fees given our economic crisis, but we did want to talk about one potential mechanism for generating funding for stormwater, and that's a stormwater utility fee. We're just at the beginning of this conversation with the board here. We'd like to explore this as we try to find a long-term solution. A stormwater utility is a common way for funding stormwater programs. We also wanted to bring you up to date with some work we had done on this issue around the stormwater facility a stormwater utility fee back in 2012, and John will talk about that. So we have about a half-hour presentation for you, so I don't want to take any more time, and so I'll pass to Maria, and I'll talk a little bit midway, and we'll do some wrap-up at the end. Thanks. Maria?
All right. Thanks, Dan. Can you all hear me? And and see the presentation on your screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about stormwater infrastructure. Often when we're talking about county stormwater infrastructure, we're thinking about roadside ditches and culverts, and the focus of that infrastructure is to move stormwater off of the road system in order to improve safety. Well, here in Lane County, we also have additional infrastructure in our county. The photo on the left here is a dry well, or UIC. And this type of infrastructure is really good in flat areas to gather stormwater locally and put it in the ground, basically. It helps with injecting it into the ground. And then we also have curb and gutter systems. The photo in the middle there shows how curb and gutters collect water and towards a catch basin. And then the image on the right shows that the catch basin, the primary focus of that is to help us with removing debris from that stormwater before it goes into a pipe network. And we have several pipe networks throughout the county. This is a photo or an aerial image of our pipe networks in blue north of Springfield. In this area, we gather stormwater into our pipe network, and we actually discharge into the McKenzie River at all of the locations where you see stars here. And when we discharge to McKenzie River, which is considered a water of the state, there is a lot of environmental regulations that come into play. So the Clean Water Act is the national, we have the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, and we have a phase 2 general permit, and this is for point source discharges associated with those stars that I just showed you on the previous slide. And then we have non-point discharges, which are covered under the TMDL, or Total Maximum Daily Load Plan for the Willamette River, which is water quality limited for temperature, bacteria, and mercury in Lane County. And so an example of a non-point discharge and the way that we assist in reducing those non-point discharges is, for example, at our park systems, we place doggy bags in order to help our residents clean up after their pets while they're enjoying our parks. And by doing that, we reduce the bacteria load that can travel through the stormwater system into waters of the state. We also have the Safe Drinking Water Act. Through this is our dry well UIC permit that allows us to discharge into groundwater where aquifers are a primary source of drinking water for many people. So we have to ensure that our stormwater injection does not cause increased pollutants into that water source. And then anytime we talk about stormwater, the key element of this is flood control and helping reduce flooding and increase safety. With some recent regulatory changes occurring with the stormwater program in this last year, the TMDL for the Willamette River was updated for mercury. And there will be some changes associated with that we'll have to implement associated with erosion sediment control requirements. Currently, our implementation plan is in the process of being updated. Our first one came out in 2008 and subsequently gets updated every 5 years. So that's something that we're currently working on in the stormwater program. And then there's the NPDES permit, which we were first issued in 2007. And was recently updated. We had an individual permit in 2007, and then we recently were given a general permit through DEQ back in March of 2019. And this new permit has a significant increased unfunded mandates that we're needing to work through, as Dan mentioned. So focusing in primarily on this NPDES program, I wanna talk a little bit about the areas that are regulated through the NPDES program. So here, this is the Eugene Springfield metro area. The hatching that's yellow is the urban growth boundaries for each city. And then the hatching that is bright green is the additional area that is regulated by our permit. And this area is set forth by the US Census. It's what they consider to be the urbanizable land around the metro area that the county is responsible for stormwater for. So all of our NPDES permits are covered under or have a regulation over both the yellow and the bright green areas here. Historically, we've dealt with our stormwater regulations in a very financially conservative fashion, which is working with the cities who also have stormwater permits, and having them help us with the regulation and the permit requirements. And we hope to move forward in using that avenue in the future. It's just that we now have a doubling of the area that are, we have to meet regulations, and all of the areas that are in the bright green are areas where we are solely responsible and cannot work through IGAs to have the cities assist us with those areas. So looking a little bit more at the infrastructure in those bright green and yellow areas, we have about 345 miles of roadway in that area. And, going back to county stormwater infrastructure, you might think that that area is primarily a ditch system, but we actually only have less than a half a mile of ditch in the MS4 area. We actually have 44 miles of pipes that are serviced by about 1,300 catch basins and about 2,300 manholes, inlets, and other things. Within that, we have about 86 dry wells, which are through our WPCF permit, where we inject stormwater into the ground. And then where we have pipe networks, we discharge to waters of the state at over 400 locations in this area. And that's a 400 locations and counting estimate. So there are more. We're just in the process of identifying all of those locations. So the workload historically for meeting the permit requirements has been spread out throughout public works, with engineering, construction services, and road maintenance doing the most of that work through about 4 FTE. And let's talk about a little bit what that work involves. So road maintenance, is doing ditch cleaning and vegetation management throughout the county, as well as within the MS4 area. Some more specific MS4 area work is the street sweeping and leaf pickup work that they do. The picture in the upper right is a Vector truck cleaning manhole or dry well or catch basin. All of that infrastructure has to be cleaned out on a regular basis. And then we also have some collaborative efforts between land management, ECS, and road maintenance for doing illicit discharge detection and elimination. And there's some increased requirements in the new phase 2 permit associated with that. And then all of this, with our aging infrastructure, really, we need to do more planning and analysis just to maintain our existing infrastructure. The image on the bottom right side of the screen shows the green lines are pipe systems and the white lines are road systems. And as you can see, as the stormwater infrastructure was developed, there are many places where the pipe systems do not line up directly with the road systems. And so because these are underground infrastructure, it's really important to have good documentation and good planning for maintaining these so that we don't have issues down the line or flood someone's backyard or things along those lines. So we want to make sure that we're doing the appropriate planning and analysis to maintain the pipe networks. Additional items that we need to update our ordinances associated with is erosion control permits for both public and private development. They've increased, there were some requirements previously, but and we are working within the UGBs for those areas, but now we have a larger area for these permits, and they've decreased the threshold at which erosion and sediment control requirements need to be permitted. And then we also have ordinances associated with after construction. How is stormwater quality kept as well as detention? And so we're going to have increase in private and public stormwater facilities, and the county is the required jurisdiction for making sure that these facilities are regularly maintained. So we'll have to do long-term inspections on these facilities as they're developed. So looking forward, these ordinances are going to need to come into effect around 2023 and 2024, and there's a lot of work that we need to do to get there. We've been looking at initial evaluation of sharing the work between the different divisions or segments of public works, and doing some preliminary analysis. We're looking at about needing 10 to 13 FTE in order to do this work. In the interim, we have some code considerations we need to evaluate. We will be updating our stormwater codes. We have intergovernmental agreement changes we need to make. And then we're also, the focus of this presentation is talking about how we're going to meet those resource requirements financially. Currently, our program is funded through road fund, but there's really an ineligibility for compliance associated with private property that land management would be doing in the future, and land management is already underfunded. And then there's also stormwater specific capital improvement projects that we need to start looking at in order to maintain our existing infrastructure, which is a process we're currently going through. Again, this is a similar slide we showed back in November when we were here, looking at first pass of financial forecasting. We're looking at going from about a $2.7 million budget for stormwater to closer to $8 million by 2024, 2025, with an increased FTE. And we really need to dig into this financial burden a little bit more and do some additional analysis in order to fully understand the financial impacts of this permit. And so that's why, part of why we've come to you wanting to further investigate the stormwater utility fee. This is a map of all of the phase 1 and phase 2 NPDES permittees in the state of Oregon. We are a phase 2. The blue are phase 1s, and 100% of the phase 1s in Oregon have a stormwater utility fee. For those counties, that's Clackamas County has Water Environment Services, Washington County has Clean Water Services, and Multnomah County combines with the city of Portland for their stormwater utility fee. For phase 2, Marion County and Jackson County have stormwater utility fees currently. Looking at their stormwater utility fees, Marion County is at about, for a standard residential home, they're about $4.55 per month. And then Rogue Valley Sewer Services, which is the group that works within Jackson County, they have a $1 service charge per month to support their stormwater program. Looking closer to home, looking at Eugene and Springfield, they have stormwater utility fees on the order, depending on size. For Eugene, it varies from $7 to upwards of $13 per month. City of Springfield, which is a similar phase 2 permit to us, they're at $15 per month per residential property. John, you've worked extensively in Washington as well. This is a pretty standard practice in Washington as well, right?
It is for both counties and cities, Moria. As you mentioned, we do a lot of work in Washington too. I could think of 9 counties which have stormwater utilities, and some with pretty substantial rates. Clark is among them, King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties, Skagit County. Most, if not all of the, or 8 of the 9 are in Western Washington. So they are a very common way of funding county stormwater programs in Washington.
Thanks, John. One other thing to note is that for phase twos within Oregon, about 80% of the phase two NPDES permittees, both cities and counties, have a stormwater utility fee. So that's why part of why we're bringing this forward, and we want to talk to you a little bit more about the initial stormwater utility fee study that Dan and John worked on back in 2012 and 2013.
Okay, thanks, Moria. So back in 2012, 2013, we were looking at a different sort of crisis with our stormwater funding. The DEQ had put forth new rules that were going to require us to remove all the dry wells. Those are those underground injection control facilities that are mostly in the River Road Santa Clara area. We were going to have to remove all of those, and there were about 80 of them, to the tune of about $10.5 million over a course of 3 years. We pushed back against that. The DEQ eventually reversed course and allowed us to allow those to stay under a permit, and so that's how we've been operating since that time. But we had engaged with FCS Group at that time to try to figure out how we were going to fund this, and the idea was a stormwater utility at that time. And so they did phase one of a feasibility study with the intention that we would move to a phase two if this was something that was palatable to the board, to dig deeper into it and to figure out how we would implement that. So we did this study, and then DEQ changed course, and so we never brought that back for consideration by the board. Now that we're facing a new sort of stormwater funding crisis, we wanted to bring this work forward and see if the board is interested in moving to phase two at this time. So I'll now pass to John Ghilarducci from FCS Group, who did work on that phase one study and can bring us up to date. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So what I'll do as a way of refreshing our collective memories of that phase one study, I'll go through and talk about the phase one work, summarize the scope of that engagement, the key policy issues that we talked about at that time. We did come up with a recommended funding approach. I'll go through that. And then we did some preliminary financial analysis too, with 2012 numbers, but I'll share those results with you, and then we'll talk about possible next steps from here. So that phase one, which was really a feasibility study surrounding the feasibility of a stormwater utility. And just so we're all on the same wavelength, a stormwater utility, or any utility, is a standalone enterprise within a government. They are usually supported by user fees or rates. So that's what a utility is. We went through a number of key policy questions, and I'll summarize those in a minute. As a first step to try and arrive at a set of recommendations on key policy issues, we spent time trying to define, because a lot of the costs of surface water management were in the road fund and still are, we had to figure out what it costs to provide stormwater service in the county at that time. And we did what's called a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, to kind of evaluate through interviews the effectiveness, the perceived effectiveness of this county stormwater program. I mentioned the preliminary financial and rate analysis that we did, and I'll share with you. And then we wrote a report. You saw the cover of that report a couple slides ago. And we did present once to the Board of County Commissioners in 2012. So the key policy issues, and we wrote short papers on each of these, laying out alternatives and pros and cons. But the first one was maybe the most important. We wanted to look at the universe of options for funding county stormwater programs and try to arrive at one that was legal and would be fair to the folks who were paying for it, would generate enough money so the county could do what it needed to do in the way of stormwater management, would be at least tolerable to the customers in the county, if you will, the folks who were paying for the services, and would be something that could be administered by county staff. We had to look at boundary options, billing options, if there's to be a rate, how it would be billed, how a rate might be structured. If there was an option for rate credits, if people did what they needed to do on their own properties to retain or mitigate stormwater, would they get a rate credit? And then, since part of the recommendation ultimately was that the county form a county service district, we had to look at the scope of county service districts to confirm that a county service district could provide stormwater service, which it can. So the funding approach that came out of those policy questions was first to establish a countywide county service district that could then impose rates and provide that stormwater service. Separate the cost of services being provided between those which were sort of regional and countywide maintenance of culverts on countywide roads, and then more localized costs, which are the costs of a higher level of service required in the urbanized portions of the unincorporated county. And those are most of the additional costs that Moria was talking about. There are those more local or area specific costs. So the county could choose to recover those more regional or countywide costs in a voted property tax or continue to fund them out of the road fund. It's the local costs which we are recommending be recovered in a utility rate. At the time, we were talking about just River Road, Santa Clara area. Now there were more urban and urbanizing areas noted on the map, in which a utility rate could apply. So the results of the SWOT analysis are summarized at a very high level here. There was some pretty detailed input gathered from county staff, from stakeholders and community groups, and from the board itself. But the general conclusions were understanding that the county had limited resources and limited staff. People were pretty satisfied with what was being done. The county was doing a really good job with the resources it had, although it was also acknowledged that more was needed. For the most part, the folks who were interviewed didn't know what the regulatory requirements were or that there were unmet capital needs out there, but credited staff for doing as well as it did with limited resources. So at the time, we estimated that stormwater service in the road fund was about $3.6 million annually. If you recall Moria's numbers from a few slides ago, that number has shrunk to about 2.7 million, in large part because road needs have increased to come out of that road fund, that limited resource. There were deferred capital projects that had accumulated to the tune of a little more than $31 million at that time. And then there were the projected regulatory requirements. Dan talked, and Moria talked about the dry well decommissioning, the underground injection control decommissioning at about 10.5 million. That's no longer a factor, but the phase 2 NPDES permit requirements, and you saw those costs. We didn't know at the time what those would be, and we have a better handle on what those costs will be now. This is the slide you saw a moment ago, trying to forecast what those needs would be, up to $8 million by 2024-25 in order to be compliant with those NPDES regulations. So our updated financial analysis, should the county decide to go forward from here, would require updating those calculated rates to match these forecasted costs. I mentioned a very preliminary financial analysis we did. We had looked at recovering countywide regional costs through a property tax that would equate to, at the time, about 44 cents a thousand. That would generate about 3.6 million per year, which would have covered what was being covered by the road fund at that time. And then for a rate to apply just in the River Road Santa Clara area at that time, a rate of $8 per impervious unit, which is essentially a single family equivalent unit. That monthly rate would generate about $1 million a year. So that's really the focus of the cost recovery at this time, is what should be recovered in the urban and urbanizing areas, and what would that rate need to be. So those phase 1 recommendations, again, were to establish a stormwater utility, which would be through a county service district, funded primarily for the costs we're talking about through the utility rate option, property tax available for those more regional or county-wide costs. Include all unincorporated areas of the county in the county service district, but apply rates only in those areas which are getting that higher level of need and service. Outsource the billing and collection of utility rates. Utility rates, for example, in Eugene and Springfield, are typically structured based on impervious surface area. So you actually base them on hard surface coverage, because that's what generates stormwater runoff that needs to be managed. And then take the following steps. Proceed to a phase 2 study to try and get more detailed on how this would work, what the rates would need to be, form the district, and then adopt the utility rates. So the next steps, potentially, obviously we're meeting with you today. Should you decide to do it, to proceed to a phase 2 study in which we would update the financial analysis with these new forecasted costs, explore updated boundary options, and confirm the billing options that are available, and then develop a public outreach plan, a more specific public outreach plan, and report back to the board before anything were to move forward.
Thanks, John. Really, in conclusion, to wrap up this presentation a little bit, the aging infrastructure and increased environmental permitting needs are going to triple the existing $2.7 million stormwater annual budget over the next 5 years. And we really need to develop some long-term consistent funding sources to support the stormwater program. These are significant financial cost increases that will occur. These ordinance requirements are out a little bit in 2023, moving in 2024. And so we want to prepare for these changes. And now is the time that we really need to do that. We understand that we are not asking you to approve a utility fee at this time. We're just asking to really study this further and understand what is possible here and where these financial impacts are going to be. Public Works wants to further investigate the feasibility of stormwater utility fee through authorization of additional study, which we would bring back to the board, as John mentioned.
Thanks, Maria. And so we'll turn over to your questions at this time, but just wanted to emphasize also 2 things. Yes, we could absorb most of this into our road fund expenses now, but it's going to severely eat into what we can do to maintain our roads and fulfill our transportation system plan, the projects that are projected in there, our capital improvement plan. But then there's also a portion that we just cannot pay with the road fund that are ineligible. So we do need to figure out how we will pay for those expenses that aren't eligible. So with that, I'll pass to your questions. Thank you.
Any questions or comments for the presenters? Commissioner Farr.
I just have one initial question, Chair Buck. Can you pop to the previous slide, the phase 2 slide? And so this is next steps of the phase 2 study. Way down at the bottom of that is develop a public outreach plan. Now, I wonder why that is so late in the process. Why do we not have a public outreach when we begin the process so that people know that you're starting to put numbers together that are going to affect their financial picture?
And I don't know, Maureen and Dan, if you'd like me to chime in there.
I don't think
this
those
is
are going to
Maria.
be chronological. It's just a list of things we would need to do.
Yeah, it absolutely could be done earlier, and in many instances, you'll start the public outreach plan and work with a citizens group. It really the specifics of the outreach plan depend largely on what you need as a board and as a county in order to generate the support to move forward, I guess.
Thank you. That's the response I would like to hear, is that the public does get involved earlier in this rather than later. Because so often when public is involved later, they say, well, you've already got the plan and now you're asking us to comment on it. It's already been done. To avoid that outcome, then getting the public involved early. And just one last little quick question, if I understand it right, you want us to be more like Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington County, and 9 counties in Washington State. Is that right?
I would, this is Maria. I would say I'd actually like us to be more like Marion County and Jackson County. They're more
okay,
of a...
9 counties at about $50 a year per household. Okay, good. Okay, that's good for me. Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Sorensen?
Is there any way to tie the increased cost to the homeowner to increased water quality? In other words, we're doing all of this so we can improve the water quality. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it has to do with water quality. You mentioned safety on the roads, but in terms of water quality, is there any metric to tie the increase in dollars that are needed to the cleanliness of the water or the survivability of the fish, or something that is some kind of metric of water quality? Could you talk about that? And I do have another question after you answer this one.
This is Maria. I would say when we do this work, we're doing it in conjunction with analyses that DEQ has developed for the TMDL program. That's a basin-wide Willamette Valley study, and there are EPA set water quality metrics that we have to meet as a collective. So there's an overall process in that. I would defer more to John and Dan a little bit more on that direct comparison, though.
The one thing, go ahead, Dan.
Go ahead.
I would say that this permit doesn't require us to do outfall sampling where we would have hard metrics to show how these the implementation of these regulations is improving stormwater over time. I do anticipate that will be coming down the road as DEQ continues to ratchet up the regulations around stormwater. Phase 1 community cities, Eugene, is tracking, has been for many years, tracking those types of metrics.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Maria. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add in that we do, with our WPCF permit, we do have water quality monitoring requirements. With our NPDES permit, we have some new monitoring requirements, but they're not at the level of water quality sampling. It's more of an observation level.
And for the purpose of basing any kind of a rate, it's been found that the best link between a rate basis and water quality, because a lot of these program costs do surround water quality, that the best basis we have is still impervious surface area, because that captures parking lots and roads. At a lot of the you know, what comes off of vehicles is a large, very large contributor to water quality degradation.
Thank you. The other question I had was had to do with the connection between the cities of Eugene and Springfield and what the residents of those two cities pay to the idea of a fee that would be imposed to try to deal with the stormwater in the urban area adjacent to the cities and rural problems. Would the people in the cities have to pay this fee as well on top of what they're already paying? Or are they excluded from the fee? Or how does that work for people like me who pay a pretty substantial fee? And most of the people in Eugene pay a pretty substantial fee for this. And people in the county have never paid for this fee.
Right. So this rate would be designed to recover the costs only in the unincorporated county. So if you're in the cities of Eugene or Springfield, you would not pay this county utility rate.
Yeah, the thought would be, I mean, this sort of would level the playing field for the people in those UGB areas. So in River Road, Santa Clara, we have this patchwork where, you know, someone's in the county, outside of the county as you go down the street. So the person in the city is paying this monthly fee. The person next to them that's in the county isn't, and they're receiving the same level of urban stormwater services. So no, the folks in the city wouldn't be paying this on top of the stormwater utility they're already paying.
One other question. What's been going on this project since 2012 when you last met with the Board of Commissioners? Why are we hearing about this 8 years later?
This went on the back burner, Commissioner, as I spoke earlier, as that looming crisis went away with the decommissioning of the dry wells. That urgency to implement this went away. We were also in a holding pattern on the permit. We were awaiting the new NPDES permit and didn't know what that was going to look like. And we were in that holding pattern that whole time where we were operating on an extended permit while the DQ worked through what was going to be in that. That was a really contentious process where cities and counties were pushing back against what the DQ was proposing. And so it took several years to finally get that permit.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Berney?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the update. I can't remember this in 2012. Actually, I was doing other things. Question, what else can a county utility district finance besides this, besides stormwater?
Oh gosh, they have a variety of different authorizations, and I'm sorry, I don't have that at my fingertips. We looked at it very specifically to see if it would be the appropriate mechanism for stormwater management. I can research that for you and get it to you through staff.
Okay, and and forgive my naivete, and whoever is the right person, please address this. But is this something we will end up having to take to voters, or is this something we just establish?
This is something that you can do as a board of county commissioners without a public vote.
So just so you know, the reason I asked what other things either a utility district or a county service district could pay for is because everything is a matter of balancing priorities. And I would be really interested if knowing whether certain housing kinds of things could be covered by this, certain renewable energy things, so that if we developed a package that we had to impose, I'd rather do it once that covered a variety of priorities than multiple times for different things. And that's the reason I asked that question. I hope that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Secondly, hearing that it didn't, my secondly, and John, I looked up as you were talking FCS group. We don't know one another, and I'm a relatively new commissioner, but I'm really kind of gung ho on local businesses doing as much as possible. So my question, actually several questions. How much would it cost for the county to engage your group to do what you have identified as a phase 2 study?
We have put together a very preliminary outline for what those services would cost. And Moria, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was around $100,000.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
And here's where I get more in the weeds than I should. I apologize, but $100,000 to update an analysis, the methodology of which you've already developed, and basically update a study. I don't question numbers because I don't know what's involved, but I do believe that there are probably local firms that you work with that could do a piece of this, i.e. the public outreach plan. But I'm just throwing that into the mix because I think it's a lens that we always need to look at. I presume this group is the group you want to work with because they're the best. But I don't know that either. And I don't know if there are other local firms that could do this work. And I just wanted to make those comments as we start, positioning for the future, both priorities of what a county service district could pay for, and then the contracting process itself. Thank you.
And thank you, Commissioner. And we would go through a public contracting process if we moved forward that would be competitive and could incorporate some local contractors on that. I did want to get back to your question about what service district can fund, and you can find that in ORS 451.010. And there's a long list there: sewage works, drainage works, street lighting, public parks, flood control, water supply, solid waste disposal, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on.
No, thank you, Dan. I got ORS 451.010.
Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Bozovich. Oh, and then Commissioner Farr.
Oh, was Commissioner Farr in the queue? I
Go ahead, Jay. You've not spoken yet.
Okay. So I'm kind of curious because, this idea was brought up back in 2012. And I think Pete and I were the only ones on the board at the time. And it was the pushback from the board about the replacing the injection wells that got us back to DEQ and had them back away from us doing millions of dollars worth of work that we really didn't have to do. Based on the fact that we understood the history of what was going on in Portland around some of the violations that they had been under for years and weren't getting sanctions. So I appreciate that the fact that we did push back a little bit rather than spend millions of dollars unneeded at that time. My question today is the idea of utility fees. For the city of Eugene, it works great because they have a municipal utility that they can basically direct to collect that fee. They already have a collection system and all that. Jackson County may have a existing countywide utility there. I'm not aware that there's one in Marion County. What do we do? There are areas of this that are outside of any utility that we could work with or connect with to try and collect this fee. How is Marion County doing a countywide fee? Did they set up their own department of billing and everything for their stormwater system?
This is Moria. My understanding, they don't have a county-wide fee, I believe. They have select areas with their phase 2 or their NPDES permit in which there are fees, and I can get back to the board with that information.
Yeah, I know that a lot of what we're looking at in the maps here overlap EWEB territory and sub-territory and Rainbow Water District. But I really think, I know for a fact that EWEB would be loath to be billing anything for us. They already don't like the fact that they're billing the city utility fees because they get more questions in their customer service department about the city fees for stormwater and other things that they've tacked on the e-web bill than they get for the electric and water that they actually supply. So I just, I'm kind of curious what that mechanism will be for utility fee, which gets kind of, I know it seems like an easy thing to do, and a lot of cities are doing it for all sorts of things, whether it's a road fee to cover road construction for infrastructure, but it's usually because they've got a municipal utility that they've already got a billing system set up for, and it's easy to do a per electric meter charge or per water meter charge, monthly service charge on those. We don't have any water meters or electric meters out there to connect an additional, dollar per household per month fee to, so we don't bill anything in that sort of way. So I'm really curious what the plan is for that, because it seems like we could eat up a whole lot of that money just establishing a system to collect the fee.
This is Moria again. I looked at their website, and they do an annual fee that's charged to property owners via their property taxes to pay for the services.
And that I'm kind of curious whether there's how the statutes work for that, because property tax bills generally are pretty tough to attach anything to. So I'll be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, I've been in close coordination with Marion County and the folks who went through this process. I'll continue to coordinate with them and use them as a good information source.
Thanks, because if it is an annual fee attached to a property tax bill, that starts looking a lot like a property tax, which requires a different formation of a service district, which does require a vote of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. And Dan, I have a question for you, but first a discussion in general. We're at Marion County. I did the math, and it looks like the households are paying about $50 a month, which is the 4.55 number times 12 months. So a question for us as we move forward is, where are our priorities? For $50 a month per household, what could we do for the Sheriff's Department, for instance, in terms of rural patrol? And we have to measure that with what you're talking about, upcoming and ongoing regulations that are being imposed upon us by the DEQ, which potentially are taking money away from public safety and putting it into the needed requirements of DEQ. All of that's going to have to be a part of the discussion as we go down the road, because we continually have people holed up in their bathroom because the Sheriff's Department cannot respond to a burglar in progress. So, it's an issue that we have to deal with regarding where are our priorities as far as funding are concerned. And my question for you, Mr. Hurley, is regarding the DEQ. They backed off on the underground, underground injection of water into dry wells. I'm not sure what your nomenclature is, but so that's not going to come back, is it? Or are we anticipating that will come back?
Commissioner, that would not come back. And then
that's not going to come back. So that's not a part of the consideration for the future dollar needs that are currently being taken from used out of the road fund. It's not the consideration for the future dollar needs for the stormwater requirements. I saw some pretty big numbers, so I'm really looking forward to us moving forward with phase 2, because as the public becomes involved in this, we do need to have the discussion. At some point, the people who are not getting sheriff's service are going to revolt because they're not getting sheriff's service and they're paying more and more just to operate their households in the rural communities. So it's a really large conversation, and I hope we don't have this conversation outside of the ongoing public safety issue regarding rural communities and a lack of service by the Sheriff's Department.
Yes,
Any other
Commissioner.
questions? Go ahead.
I'm not sure that $50, I've never heard of a stormwater fee that high. I mean, I think Portland was the highest at like $20 back in 2012 when we looked at this. So I'd like to look at that and make sure we're not talking about an annual fee, but we wouldn't be considering anything nearly that high. But getting back to priorities.
what was shown on the slide, Dan, was $455 a month. I just multiplied that by 12. So
Okay, so that was annual. Okay, I thought you said monthly. But you know, one thing, these are requirements by the DEQ that we will have to fulfill, or we face significant penalties to the tune of thousands of dollars if we don't comply. So that will
Tens
kind of
of
force
thousands
our
of
hand.
dollars.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Per day.
that will force our hand in ways that rural patrols don't. But not saying that that's not a high priority. And I do think that service districts can be set up to fund patrol, but I could be incorrect.
and just going to say that if you're the ones holed up in the bathroom while there's a burglary in progress, I don't know what dollar amount you put on that.
Commissioner Burney.
Well, I want to make it clear, I did not raise my hand to answer that question. Dan and group, I appreciate the presentation, and in that, you know, I asked that question, which Commissioner Farr agreed with. It does open up not a can of worms, but perhaps a can of opportunity to look at what those districts are allowed to finance, what various priorities of the county are, including this, and maybe turn a lemon into lemonade. So I just, from me, I don't want you to feel at all discouraged, but I do, on behalf of the county, want to exploit any opportunity I see.
Mr. Mokarski.
Well, I probably should have jumped in a little earlier when the conversation veered to public safety. And I just want to be clear that, you know, Dan and Moria and our public works folks are responsible for bringing forward challenges and analysis and solutions in the areas that they're responsible for. They're not responsible for public safety. We have a whole nother team of folks that have that responsibility. And I just want to be, I mean, I certainly think that as we talk about fees, the board is going to have to weigh ability to pay for residents and all of those things. But I just, I know we spent a healthy amount of time during the budget process talking about whether or not, you know, road funds should be used for public safety. And I just want, I'm happy to take on questions about public safety, but I don't expect that our public works team is going to have those answers, nor should they have them.
Commissioner Farr, and then Commissioner.
And Ms. Mokarski, that was intended for you to hear, not for them, but they just happen to be in the room listening.
Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. I just want to be clear. I'm asking a lot of questions about mechanisms, but Oregon is decades behind in regulating their stormwater discharges relative to water quality. You know, other states moved into this decades ago. I spent most of the 80s implementing water quality devices in Maryland to protect the Chesapeake Bay. We're now at 2020, and we're way behind in protecting water quality. It's, you know, stormwater infrastructure is a necessary part of urbanized infrastructure, but it's also a part that, if it's not done correctly, can lead to contamination of our public waters. So I don't deny that it's not a necessary thing to do and needs some kind of funding stream. I just want to make sure my questions are more about how we do it and do it well and do it fairly. Because one of my concerns is somebody that's in a $200,000 home from the 50s on, you know, 1/8 of an acre in Santa Clara is going to pay the same fee as the person that's in the newer subdivision further out in Santa Clara that, you know, is a 6,000 square foot, you know, McMansion out there that the Butlers built, you know, out towards, you know, Beacon Drive. So, yeah, that, you know, if you're paying by household and purely by household, it may not be, you know, there was that thing about fair. The secondary thing is how does it impact the businesses? And what are they paying how are they paying? You know, what is their rates based on? I keep hearing household rates, but what about all those businesses in unincorporated, Lane County in the ICCO in particular, which we're talking about River Road, Santa Clara, which is that area there as you go up Prairie Road between 99 and Northwest Expressway. There's a lot of impervious surface there. So, the devil's in the details, but I do understand the need for a funding stream. And this is kind of separate from, I think, a little bit from the public safety discussions and all that. I agree. We have to have priorities. And I also wish there was a DEQ for public safety that would fine us for not providing the required public safety and would force our hands towards improving our sheriff's department. But we don't have that. We've set that up for various, for water pollution. We've set it up for air pollution, everything else, but we're not setting it up for how we're protecting we're protecting our water, our air, and our soil, and all sorts of things with all these regulatory agencies that can fine us as a government, but there's no one there to protect personal, property and persons, lives, that's going to fine us for not providing that protection. So I think I kind of like what Commissioner Farr sort of brings into the discussion, but I do want to make it clear that this is really a necessary piece of infrastructure, something we're way behind in doing. And I just want to see what the details are.
Okay, any other comment or questions from staff? Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I thought this was a really great discussion, and I really look forward to the next steps. I'd be happy to make a motion, Madam Chair, if you think it's a good thing to do as part of the meeting. But I think that it's well said that we need to continue working on this problem. I also agree that other areas of the country have done a lot more on stormwater protection than we have in Oregon. I think it's because we started out with cleaner water, at least in the 70s. Our water was generally cleaner than other places. So the imperative to do something wasn't seen. But I do believe that we are behind now in stormwater protection issues. For those of the staff, board, and public that are listening, I just want to say that my best way of explaining to people the seriousness of stormwater is to go to any site along the Willamette River, either side of the Willamette River as it goes through a community along the Willamette River, and look. Usually this is in September or October, the first major rain after 2 months or even 3 months of relative lack of precipitation. You go out there and look at those stormwater places where they're dumping water straight into the Willamette River. And that first slide that staff put on the at the beginning of this presentation, where there's all this trash, and thank you for putting that up, trash and oily water, you can multiply that by 10 of what you would see at a common location along the bike path along the Willamette River in Eugene. And so I just think this is something we need to keep working on. I think the regulatory impact will be greater, not less. As we begin to understand just how dangerous and dramatic it is to dump this stuff right into major clean waterways. And thanks very much for this great work, and thanks to you in the department for bringing this to the board's attention. I think we got to keep moving with it. Thank you.
Well, this one is just a work session. It doesn't need a motion. I think although staff would really like to see us give some direction, but not necessarily an emotion. I was going to ask, you know, from all the discussion that I've been listening to, it doesn't look like we have much choice other than to go to a phase 2, because the alternative would be to decide to implement something that we know of right now. And we don't have all that information yet. So for me, it feels like we must go on to phase 2 in order to figure out where we even go from here and how we implement any changes in costs, whether it be voter or whether it be the fees. For me, it feels like if we ask voters outside of the districts that are specifically highlighted and here, that probably won't go over very well. So, you know, if we need to do a special district for fee collection, all that will probably come out when we do public comment and get public input, because it's really those folks that are going to be affected the most. Yes, Commissioner Burney.
Chair, I just wanted to state that if we needed 3 head nods to move forward, or if staff did, I'd be a third, if I hear you correctly. And I just think that all of the concerns that we brought up demonstrate the board's very interested in the details and implementation before we commit to anything beyond a study for how we would move into this.
Any other comments?
I've already nodded.
I kind of see us moving towards going ahead with the phase 2, unless somebody says otherwise. Okay, staff, do you need anything more from us on this particular subject?
No, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Board.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
We will move back to item 8A, which was county administration announcements.
I don't have anything to add from my earlier comments, Chair, so unless there are questions for me on anything. We did put out, I will just make a brief comment that we put out as part of our daily messages to employees yesterday, a reentry training. And so we've made a training available as we look to phase 2. We will be bringing some employees back to more on-site work. We are requiring 6 feet of physical distance in the workplace, or a barrier of some kind, a cubicle wall or a sneeze guard. If that can't be maintained, where 6 feet of distance or a physical barrier can't be maintained, we are requiring a face covering. And so we put out those new requirements and a training for employees as part of that effort. So I think that's, and then of course we have our reentry task force that is developing all of our requirements and monitoring that, and really working with our unions and with employees to implement all of this in a collaborative way. And so we look forward to that, in addition to all the other things happening. Happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Any questions? I don't see any, so we'll move on to item 12A, Commissioners' business announcements. Any announcements from anybody? I'll just jump in there. Then on May 21st, we had our budget deliberations. On that same night, the League of Women Voters was doing a webinar on redistricting, so none of us got to watch it, but I do want to watch it, and it was taped, so, or recorded, I should say. That dates me. So if people are interested in watching that for future meetings about that subject, it's out there and available. The other kind of announcement is, you know, we were talking in agenda team about when would be a likely time that we would come back to Harris Hall to have meetings. We're also looking to other agencies in Lane County and what they were doing, namely the cities. It seems like with the work being done in Harris Hall on the roof and not quite into phase 2 and knowing what phase 2 is really going to be, or even what phase 3 is going to be, it seems like the earliest that we would most likely be able to come back and do meetings in Harris Hall would be after the July 4th holiday. And even then, we're not quite sure what will be happening in our reopening phases. So we're just taking that week by week at the moment. And I'll just keep updating everybody as to how that comes out. It's also very challenging. We're not really able to do half webinar, half Harris Hall. We need to pretty much pick one or the other. So we'll keep doing our webinars for now and until we know more. Commissioner Sorensen.
Thanks very much. I think we should go by the guidelines where if it's possible to conduct work remotely or at home, we ought to be following those guidelines ourselves. It bothers me sometimes when government doesn't have to go along with what private people have to go along with, and it seems like if they're still sending the message, either Oregon Health Authority or whomever is legally imposing these rules on us, we ought to be following them. So I would be hesitant to go out in front of those guidelines. And if it is possible to conduct the work at home and it's safer, then I think we should do that, particularly since we haven't heard anything definitive from our public health staff on when this so-called second wave is going to hit. We keep asking them each week and they keep saying they don't know. So I think we want to err on the side of caution if they don't know.
And we do have, we have Karen Gaffney there at Agenda Team and Public Health filling us in along the way. We just don't quite have enough information yet. And the only other thing was just that statement I said earlier about how often we want to have the COVID updates. So let's think about that over the next week. And if we still want to do it every Tuesday or not, and we can get some feedback after you've had some time to think about that. Any other announcements from anybody? Okay, I don't see any, so we'll go to future board assignment requests. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair, but this is regarding a discussion that we started to have this morning, and I think maybe deferred to this afternoon. I have a request for a resolution. During the morning agenda, we discussed events surrounding the death of George Floyd and others who have died in similar fashion before him. We discussed racism, brutality, and oppression, and we're at a point in history where we can really help focus on permanent binding solutions. We're at a point where there is focused attention and we can be a part of the focus and a part of permanent solutions. We have an Equity and Access Advisory Board. They meet tomorrow. I'd like to ask staff to work with the board immediately tomorrow to draft a resolution for consideration next Tuesday by the Board of County Commissioners. A resolution that does three things. Recognizes this moment in time as one where we have a choice to make as an agency and as a community. Two, has actionable items for the organization for Lane County. And three, doesn't focus on rioting or property damage.
Thank you for that. It's my understanding that they are already kind of working on something, but maybe it's the things that you just mentioned. But I'm all in support of that myself. Are there more than 3 head nods or 3 or more? I think we're all, we like that. Yeah, Commissioner Burney?
On the one hand, I agree with Commissioner Bozovich. I try and stay away from resolutions, but this is very important. I agree. This is a unique moment in history. Are you sure you don't want it to focus on violating property rights there? Commissioner Farr, I'm sorry. I'm making jest. I know this is a serious moment and a serious proposal, and you have my head nodded.
Thank you. I think staff may, Mr. Mokrowski, staff may be prepared to do that work tomorrow at your direction.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't seen the agenda. I attend those meetings, so I certainly can talk to Mo Young and on what the agenda is, and we can bring that before the Equity and Access Advisory Board. Whether or not they'll be able to accomplish that at the meeting or in what their process will be, that's just going to be determined by them. I will tell you that I've been in communication with Clay Stillwell, who's our procurement supervisor, Greg Rickoff, our operations director, and Mo Young, our equity coordinator, today to talk about creating a list of either Black-owned businesses or if we don't categorize by Black-owned, minority-owned businesses, which we do have a list of certified minority-owned businesses, and have that be one way in which we can help support the Black community and communities of color through these challenges. You've seen on social media recently, there's been this blackout kind of focus. And so several of us have had the conversation, well, could we do something that's even more productive than just blacking out a social media site? Could we actually help support our local Black and minority owned businesses? And so we are working on that. We think that's a small but actionable item that we can put out a call to support our local businesses in Lane County. And so that's one thing that we're going to do, but I'm certainly happy to bring forward to the Equity Board tomorrow this request, because I think it received head nods.
Thank you, Ms. Mokrowski. Thank you to the board.
Steve, forgive me for beating a dead horse. I really think that the strategic plan component that talks about the lens of waiting for all procurements, all contracted services, locally owned businesses, and we could incorporate women and minority owned businesses, obviously, and should. But also as it relates to hiring and bringing people into training, there are so many things on the books in place that are substantive and pragmatic and are absolutely consistent with what Commissioner Farr has proposed and that we have agreed with him on.
Yeah, I think what is being asked for in this moment is, what can we all do as a community? What are productive ways that we can support our communities of color at this time? And so I think it's a great conversation, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity because the meeting is happening tomorrow. So thank you, Commissioner Farr, for bringing that up now for us to bring that to them, have the conversation, come up with some recommendations and actions that we all can pursue.
Commissioner Bosevich.
Thank you. And I appreciate that Commissioner Farr specifically said one of the things that needs to have in it is actionable items. Because, as much as I think it's, resolution in this case is, and this is an interesting time, and I have actually supported a resolution back in end of November of 2016 that didn't really have actionable items in it because it was necessary at that time in the community. But my preference is to have ones with actionable items. So I would like to suggest maybe one item to place in there, which is to have some kind of emphasis on recruiting people of color into our sheriff's office and our law enforcement agencies. Because I think one of the issues we have is a lack of people of color in those agencies. And I think that may make a difference in how people of color see those agencies if they're seeing themselves in uniform and in law enforcement. And I think that is an actionable item that would actually work directly towards resolving some of what the concerns are, which is some kind of institutionalized racism in law enforcement. We need to make sure we have law enforcement be representative of the community.
Any other announcements? Okay, I don't see any. We'll move on to review of assignments.
So I just have that one, the request for a resolution, a board order is what we call it, with those 3 points that Commissioner Farr mentioned, including actionable items that we'll bring to the Equity and Access Advisory Board for discussion tomorrow. And I think Commissioner Bozovich's suggestion is a good one around recruitment of diverse workforce, as well as particularly in the law enforcement field.
Okay. Well, with that, we have a brief break before item 14, which is an executive session. It is 4 o'clock time certain, and we have a separate call in for that. So I will read us into executive session at this point for the 4 o'clock exec session meeting. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660 subsection 2 subsection D, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive sessions for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. We reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise. We don't see that need to arise today, but we always reserve the right. So with that, we will Commissioner Farr.
Chair Buck, I think before the cameras are turned off, I will declare a potential conflict of interest. My son is a mental health therapist, works for Lane County, and is an ASME a member. And thereby there's a potential conflict of interest. I do not perceive an actual during this discussion that we'll have this afternoon, so I will participate in the discussion this afternoon.
Okay, very good. With that, we'll be in recess till our 4 o'clock executive session. Thank you.
Thank you.